Welcome to a multi-state perspective of MTSS, achieving results for all students. A presentation by Kansas MTSS and Michigan My Blissey. Originally provided at the NASD Annual Conference and Business Meeting in Atlanta, Georgia on October 8, 2013. Though the data being shared and the presenters are from Kansas and Michigan, please do not think of this as only a Kansas and Michigan story. We are going to share our view of MTSS as we see the commonalities across states, even beyond Kansas and Michigan. Regardless of the state and the framework, the commonalities and the critical components and practices that create an effective MTSS are very specific. While all of the MTSS frameworks across the nation grew out of the same research base and align with the blueprints for RTI such as NASD has produced, we find the practices can even be more specific than is commonly discussed. Our vision for MTSS is a durable integrated framework that is implemented with fidelity and is focused on improving the outcome for all students. MTSS is a school-wide reform model. It is a philosophy about how to approach services and restructure schools so that collaboration and the use of data for addressing academic and behavioral supports is done in an integrated manner. Highly effective MTSS frameworks are not about struggling students or about the way to identify students for special education. It is about improving the instruction for all students, whether it is core instruction or intervention. The potential MTSS and the documented evidence suggest that it can improve the instructional outcomes for all students, both those that are at grade level as well as those that are above or even struggling to learn. It improves the collaboration among teachers and increases the use of data and database decision making. The primary goal is to improve the instructional outcomes for all students to grade level or above. The point of the philosophy behind MTSS is to not have low expectations, but to believe and to actually provide instruction in such a way that all students do achieve to grade level. Again, I remind you, as we share the story today, please do not be looking and thinking about state-specific models in this presentation, but think about the essential and specific elements of effective MTSS that are common across these two states as well as others in the nation. With this in mind, we'll begin our story with the tale of two boys.
To tell our story, it makes sense to begin with the tale of two boys. On this slide, you're looking at two second-grade boys in a mid-sized district in the state of Kansas. One was identified as needing special education support, one who is not identified for that. When you look at students in this process in the fall, we look at an RCBM for second grade students, and in particular we're looking at oral reading fluency. Two factors that we look at this point is how fluent the child is as well as how accurate they are. We believe that accuracy always trumps fluency, and at the second grade level we're looking for 95% accuracy. You can see from both of these young men that neither one are even close to that mark. The other number you see here indicates their fluency, or how many words correct per minute they were able to read. Both of these boys are also well below target score on this, indicating a need for Tier 3 or intensive support. One of the other things that we do in an MTSS process, though, is we try to back up and see where, in fact, your skills stopped. So for second grade, a student who's showing Tier 3 needs in oral reading fluency causes us to take a look at their nonsense word fluency score, which is what you see in the first box. Nonsense word fluency measures the ability for a child to put together letter sounds with the letters that they see and build just short vowel words. The number actually does not reflect the number of words, but actually the number of sounds. So when you're looking at these young men, again, you're seeing pretty severe needs. We believe this target for nonsense word fluency should be hit, research says, about mid-first grade. So not having this skill in place at the start of second, at a minimum, places these boys about a half year behind in their skills. Now, in the not-so-distant past, the student's label would have dictated what happened next for these children. But in an MTSS, the data dictates where intervention begins, regardless of identification or lack thereof. So in a system that makes instructional decisions based on data, what can happen in just 12 to 16 weeks of intervention? In MTSS, we say actually quite a lot. When you look at the winter benchmarking data for both of these boys, you can see quite significant changes have occurred in both of their reading. Not only did the boys clean up their nonsense word fluency, but take a look at their oral reading fluency numbers as well as their accuracy. Keep in mind that we believe children should be at least 95% accurate in second grade, and these boys are both at the 96% range. But their numbers for fluency place them in Tier 1, or what we would consider at grade level status. I think it's very significant when you look at Bill's growth from reading only 9 words correct in a minute in the fall up to 73 words in just 12 to 16 weeks. So the trajectory for both of these young men academically has been changed through this process. Incidentally, the student who is identified as needing special education services is Ted.
These types of outcomes can also be seen with behavior. Here is outcome data from one Michigan elementary school over the course of 4 years. This school saw a decrease in referrals from 847 referrals during the 2009-2010 school year to 149 referrals during the 2012-2013 school year. This equates to 233 student hours and 291 administrator hours recovered. Imagine the impact on instruction from that amount of recouped time. We also see similar outcomes at the middle school level. In this example, over the course of 2 school years, we see a decrease from 247 office discipline referrals to 72 office discipline referrals the next year. This equates to 58 student hours regained and 73 administrator hours recovered.
This slide outlines the data from a larger to mid-high school in Kansas. This particular district leadership team began looking at what was happening for some of their students who'd been identified as needing significant behavior supports who were attending their alternative school. They were following up with those kids on a post-graduation survey and were really disappointed with the very low percentage of students who were employed or were furthering their education either through vocational training or actually going on to college. So they began to build an MTSS system for behavior and made the determination that these students would now be returned to the high school with their peers. What they saw in 1 year's time is pretty dramatic. What you're seeing on this slide actually are the data points before those children returned to the public high school, and then the second year when they had been returned. We still see almost all of those office referrals cut in half with the addition of those students. I think of particular significance is one of the young men who had been attending the alternative high school in the past. A few weeks into the year, he caught up with the special education director in the hallway. This was a student who had lots of high needs that they were very concerned about, but had very strong skills where construction and working with his hands were concerned. So as part of his daily curriculum, he was involved in a work study. He had vocational classes that were building those trade skills for him, and he was being highly successful. The first question out of the student's mouth was, "Why couldn't I have done this before?" As you look at the data on this slide, you're also seeing how much time was recovered for instruction as well as for principals. Results can happen very quickly in a district that's using an MTSS process. You're looking at data here from some K-6 students in a random sampling from across the state. We're looking at their growth between fall and winter only. In our process, we like to see about 80% of the students' needs being met by the core. And you can see by winter we're getting much closer to that goal as the Tier 1 pie gets larger. A couple things to keep in mind is this is only after 12 to 16 weeks of intervention at the most, and we're looking at kids from a cross-section of schools across the state.
Not only is it possible to see changes quickly, the changes can be sustained at a district level over time. In this case, we see the percentage of students at benchmark, represented by the green portion of the bar graphs, steadily increasing over the years. We also see fewer students needing strategic or an intensive supports, represented by the yellow and red portion of the bars over time. You'll also notice there is a black line graph showing a steady increase in the percentage of students eligible for free and reduced lunch over the same period of time. Despite changes in the population, this district is seeing and sustaining improved outcomes for students by implementing a multi-tier system of supports.
When we began to look at data at the statewide level, we asked schools who've been involved in this process for at least a year without trainer support if they would be willing to share their data. So you're looking at data where we've compared children against themselves, looking child by child at their fall data compared to their winter data. We looked at over 2,000 students in grades K through 6 who had been in interventions for somewhere between 12 to 14 weeks. These come from children who are in small to mid-sized Kansas schools, and they were randomly selected by volunteering their data. We are looking strictly at fall to winter CBM reading data based on the most predictive indicator for that time of year as well as at grade level. As we prepared this presentation for the National CEC Conference, my colleague and I had one really big question, and that was how do special education students fare in this process when we compare them to all other students? And we were pleasantly surprised to be able to say even better than their peers when it came to making those larger gains. This chart reflects only students who were identified as needing Tier 2 or Tier 3 support in the fall who moved to a less intensive tier of support by winter. And at virtually every grade level, our students identified for special ed services responded even more strongly than the general population. At kindergarten, that rate was almost double, where almost 3 out of every 10 identified kindergartners moved from red to yellow, yellow to green, or even in some cases from red to green. As a composite, better than 1 out of 10 of our identified students gained at least one tier in 12 to 14 weeks of intervention. Now, when we looked at students who became better readers as a whole, regardless of whether they changed tiers, 88% of all of our students improved their reading in this process during just that short amount of time. One of our favorite pieces of data came from the 4th grade, where we know children have had a lot of time to get behind in reading. When we looked at those students who were identified for special education services, 98% of those 4th graders became better readers as a part of this process.
The story you have heard and the data shared shows how an effective MTSS works from the individual student level up through the state. To achieve this, we are all working from the vision shared with you earlier in the presentation. In all highly effective MTSS models, it becomes part of the school-wide culture. The student data is always being examined by staff to ensure each student reaches standard. MTSS does not begin at Tier 2. It begins in Tier 1 in core instruction. And it doesn't end in Tier 3 or special education identification. It is the philosophy of never selling kids short, and that the school as a whole has a cultural responsibility for ensuring that each student achieves. This type of system isn't achieved in a building alone as an island of excellence. The leadership must come from the top, starting at the SEA and moving to the district leadership level. In this graphic, modified from Michigan's work, displays a cascading model of support for MTSS from the SEA down to the student level, showing the improvement of academic and behavioral outcomes. This cascading model is necessary to be able to tell the type of story you have just heard. Though there are different structures and authorities within each state, the grouping of the blocks may be slightly different, but it comes down to the fact that these are the essential functions and the levels of support that must be in place to achieve the vision which we have shared. With the understanding of the kind of outcomes that can be achieved and the structure that allows the creation of sustainable MTSS, next we will move to the discussion of specific components that allow for an MTSS to be effective. The cascading model of support provides infrastructure supporting districts as well as teachers to change practices so that student outcomes can be changed. The components of what is actually changing are also consistent across the states. What we look at and see most common are evidence-based curriculum, high-quality instruction, comprehensive assessment systems, database decision-making, and fidelity of implementation efforts. Each of these items will be discussed in greater detail by members of our presentation team today.
Not many people would disagree with these components, but how many of you have heard of a horse? Go on, picture a horse in your mind. Is this what the horse you pictured looked like? Maybe, maybe not. Just like the horse, when we picture the components of MTSS, it is possible that it brings to mind different variations of what is meant by each component. Okay, next question. How many of you have actually ridden a horse? Go ahead, feel free to raise your hand if you've ridden a horse. Some people listening may be avid horse riders, while others are novice or may have never actually ridden a horse. So we went to the source. We went to Wikipedia to find out instructions on how to ride a horse. Wikipedia provides multiple step directions on how to explicitly ride a horse. Their directions start with how to mount your horse, including which side you need to mount the horse from, which foot goes into the stirrups. Their directions are quite explicit. Wikipedia's directions go on to indicate how to do things like adjust the stirrups. The third step indicates how to ask the horse how to walk. The directions go on. We won't walk you through all the steps. But just like picturing the horse, there are variations in what educators may picture and do when they think of each of the components of MTSS. The work that both Kansas and Michigan does includes Operationally defining these components for school teams.
To effectively support instruction and intervention within classrooms, a critical component of an MTSS is that the school have an aligned and comprehensive plan that utilizes evidence-based curricula at all levels. A curriculum protocol is a method of predetermining interventions that allow for an immediate response to student needs. It identifies what is used at each tier for each instructional focus, and problem solving is used to match those interventions and strategies to the needs of the students as indicated through a diagnostic assessment process. A curriculum protocol is the first line of defense for students who begin receiving the instruction they need as soon as possible. In addition to the protocol interventions, the system must also provide problem solving to adjust interventions when the protocol interventions are not matched to student needs or if the student is not making adequate progress as shown with progress monitoring data. As the level of intensity of support gets higher, additional problem solving may be necessary to customize interventions to meet the intense needs of these students. This example of a curriculum protocol shows what a school uses for their core, Tier 2 and Tier 3 curriculum. This provides a systematic way to provide the appropriate instruction for all of the students in a school or district. To clarify, not all students who score below benchmark get the same intervention or program. As part of the problem-solving practice, diagnostic information is used to identify skill deficits, and then students are placed in small groups based on specific skills. Those groups are then matched to the intervention that will best meet their needs. We use progress monitoring data to indicate how well the interventions are working and if further group or individual problem solving is then warranted. Tier 1 is the core reading program, or what all students will be receiving. Tier 2 is targeted instruction that is intended to fill specific gaps in reading skills, and Tier 3 is the most intense instruction and is for students who are missing many skills and need a more intense, comprehensive, or systematic curriculum. In MTSS, Tier 3 does not equate to special education. You will find students who are identified as special education in Tier 2, and some may need support in only Tier 1. It is not that there are particular interventions that should be selected, but that the interventions chosen are evidence-based and meet the needs of the students as determined by the data that a school collects. The MTSS model does not ask that schools go out and buy a lot of new resources or curriculum, or that there is a list of particular interventions. However, it does encourage schools to analyze the resources they have, reallocate and restructure their resources, and to use their data to have regular conversations about the effectiveness and appropriateness of their curriculum, programs, and interventions. A protocol can also be used to identify gaps in curriculum and where resources may need to be shifted. The protocol, when combined with group and individual problem solving, helps teachers and interventionists meet the diverse needs of all students. The MTSS framework is built upon strong educational practices that should be the center of all instruction. So just think about these questions for a few minutes. Do you know high-quality instruction when you see it? And more importantly, how do you know? And how are instructional practices currently selected? Instructional practices should be based off scientifically based research, and professionals need to consider the evidence surrounding curriculum instruction. In his book, Visible Learning, John Hattie has done extensive research on the effect sizes of various influences on student achievement. And what he has said is that just about any intervention can show that it makes some kind of difference on student learning, but what we are looking at is what makes the most improvement. Not just what works, but what works best. Any effect size above 0 means that the achievement has been raised by that instructional practice. However, we want to know what makes a visible improvement in student achievement. And what Hattie did was identify a hinge point, or a point at which the influence was said to be making a visible difference in student learning. And what we do is we use that hinge point as a basis for discussions about the effect of teaching on students. We now know what instructional practices have the most evidence base. Sometimes we think we know what are effective practices, but we need to continually evaluate the effect of those instructional practices and what they have on student learning. We know that instruction matters, but not just any instruction, those instructional practices that give us the biggest impact. As part of the MTSS process, the school will continually evaluate the effectiveness of their instructional practices and use that information to design effective instruction. The data collected helps us know if these instructional practices are effective and help identify any areas of professional development. Allocating resources to sustain and support those instructional practices and influence that have at least an effect size of 0.4 or higher, and use those as discussions as to what changes need to be made to the instructional practices that are currently being used. The quality of the data-based decision-making relies on the type of data that is collected. The assessments in a comprehensive assessment system are linked to a decision-making model and provide a method of accurate and early identification of a student's need for support. The data is what is going to drive the instruction for the students and not an identification. MTSS has a specific set of data analysis procedures. Because of the assessments chosen, we can determine with a high level of precision those areas of deficit. Those areas are addressed through very targeted and focused instruction. In addition, the assessments are formative so that teams use that information to inform their instruction on a regular basis. They use the data to make instructional decisions. We use universal screening data for all students 3 times a year to determine which students may need extra support and need further diagnostic procedures. This data is also critical for schools to determine how effective is core instruction and what percentage of students are in need of Tier 2 and Tier 3 support. Students who are flagged as needing supplemental intervention receive intervention at that intensity level. Students who are flagged as needing intensive intervention begin receiving intensive Tier 3 instruction right away. More time, smaller group size, and possibly a specific intervention. Through those diagnostics, the instructional focus is determined and students are grouped according to their skill needs. Progress monitoring is conducted on a frequent basis to determine if the student is making progress, how much progress, and allows us to see if any instructional adjustments are necessary. Again, this data is used to make decisions about how well the intervention is working and if it is intense enough that the gap is closing between that student and the target. So what we would ask schools to do is to create a comprehensive assessment plan. That would be one of the major structuring tasks that would be completed by a leadership team. There are a myriad of assessments out there, and so we want to know, are the assessments being used appropriately? For MTSS, we might ask a team to list their current assessments and what they are doing with them and that data to improve instruction for the students. Those are some difficult but valuable conversations as they discuss what to do with the data, what is the purpose of the assessment, which students are those assessments used for, and etc., so that we can create the most efficient assessment system. As I said, screening assessments are given to all students to determine which students may need more support. Well, are we going to give every kid a diagnostic assessment? No, because not every student needs a diagnostic assessment, just like not every patient that goes to the doctor needs an MRI. That is, however, determined by what the screening data is telling us. It is crucial that the staff understand the purposes and intentions of each type of assessment so that the data can be used appropriately. Again, they evaluate the uses of what assessments they currently have in place and the purposes of those assessments so that the assessment system is efficient and appropriate for the students they are used with. What are some of the ways decisions are being made in schools today? In MTSS, everyone at all levels is using data to have conversations and make decisions. This is not one isolated team, and the structures are put in place to allow for this problem solving to be happening. We don't make decisions based on what we feel a student needs or a guess, but on what the data is telling us. Problem solving happens at all levels, at the grade level, at the building level, and at the district level. Everyone is involved, which fosters the collaborative culture in the school. District and building level teams look at data at a more systemic level and problem solve around resources, professional development, and systemic issues. Grade level teams do the problem solving around matching intervention to student needs, grouping students with similar needs together, and looking at the progress monitoring data on regular intervals to determine the effectiveness of the instruction. Teams problem solve around groups of students first and then down to individual students if needed. We want teams to look at the data, think about what the data is saying, and then adjust the instruction if necessary. By using this process, every student gets what he or she needs. As teachers become more experienced and comfortable interpreting data, the practice of data-based decision-making and conversations are more pervasive throughout the school. Data walls or data boards can be used to keep the data visible. This can be very motivating for teams to visually see the progress of individual students. On this board, student names and assessment results are written on a sticky note that correlates to the student's intensity level on their universal screener. So you can see that by the next universal screening time, the teams had moved the sticky notes to other areas of the board to show their progress. For example, you see some red sticky notes in the yellow or middle section. That tells us that the student moved from an intense intervention to a supplemental intervention. You might also see if any students in the green or yellow have slipped to a more intense category. You can also get a nice visual of the percentage of students at benchmark. These conversations become the focus of grade level meetings. Another advantage to these database decision-making conversations is that we really start to hear the teachers referring to the students as our kids instead of her kids or my kids. The culture of the school starts to change and they begin to take ownership of all students.
The final component is fidelity of implementation. When you think about fidelity, don't think of it as another F word. Here are the F words we were thinking of. Fortunate, fun, fantastic. What? Were you thinking of something else? We know schools implementing with fidelity are achieving better outcomes for students. Let's take a closer look at some data that will help us demonstrate this point. First, the two bars on the left represent the percent of students at benchmark. The green bar represents the percentage of students at benchmark in schools that are implementing with fidelity. The blue bar represents the percentage of students at benchmark in schools who are not implementing with fidelity. We see more students at benchmark in those schools with high implementation fidelity. When you move over to the middle two bars, you'll see representation of the percent of students at an intensive level of need. In this case, the green bar again represents the schools that are implementing with fidelity, and we see a smaller percentage of students in need of intensive supports. Whereas the blue bar represents the schools who are not implementing with fidelity, and we're seeing more students in need of intensive supports. Finally, on the right, we're looking at the discipline referrals per 100 students per day. Again, the schools with high implementation, we're seeing a lower number of referrals per day per 100 students than for those schools that are not implementing with high fidelity. We know that as implementation of MTSS for reading improves, student reading performance also improves. Here we have a bar graph representing the implementation fidelity data over the course of 4 years. It also includes the percent of students at DIVLS benchmark, represented by the green line graph, as well as the percentage of students in need of intensive support, represented by the red line graph. We're seeing over time that as the school's fidelity implementation scores increase, the percentage of students who are at or above benchmark increases, and we're seeing decreases in the percentage of students in need of intensive supports. Not only are we seeing these kinds of outcomes for reading, we're also seeing that as implementation of MTSS for behavior improves, behavior problems are declining. Here, again, we have 4 years of implementation fidelity data for behavior implementation efforts. We're seeing that as the increase in fidelity occurs, we're seeing a steady decrease in the number of office discipline referrals per 100 students per day.
The use of effective interventions and strategies alone is not sufficient to be able to achieve the kind of results that you've seen today, let alone be able to actually have the data to provide the story from the state level down to the individual student levels. To achieve this, it takes a larger system of actual delivery to ensure that all of this can be achieved and that it is being done with fidelity. While we've been discussing the system of MTSS and what it takes to keep it in place, you may also recognize this graphic from the implementation research. This is what needs to be attended to so that we can actually see the changes that we have been talking about today. This is how we actually change practices within districts. It is the leadership and as well as the competency drivers of selection, training, and coaching. It is also the organizational drivers of having the data systems in place so that interventions can actually be matched to student need. These are the type of things that need to be considered at all levels of our system. Hopefully at this point you can see how the common elements run throughout all the MTSS frameworks. Part of it is driven by the fact that it's that philosophy of what MTSS is, that it is not about special education or the identification of special education students, but it really is that philosophy of improving the instruction for all students to meet whatever their needs are. A few of the other practices I think that are critical to think about that was presented today is the issue that Tier 3 is not about special ed, that there are many students within our system that need intensive intervention that are not special education. And the other critical thing I think is the idea of the tiers describe instruction. That is, that they are not sequential, they are not steps. Students do not have to move through Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Students that need intensive intervention receive Tier 3 instruction, regardless of whatever their identification is, or whether they have received intervention prior to this. These are the systems and practices that allow successful MTSSs to work for all students, including the 2 students that we heard about earlier today. So what we're going to be challenging folks with is to think about where your state is with the implementation of MTSS in relationship to those critical elements and the drivers, and what are your next steps. What are the next steps that you can do to move your state forward to save Bill and Ted and every other student in the system? The Kansas MTSS website and the Michigan My Blissey website both contain significant information about what was presented today. You can also contact either of us through our websites. On behalf of Kansas MTSS and Michigan My Blissey, we would like to thank NASD for providing us the opportunity to provide this presentation, and we'd also like to thank you for listening.